After 3 intense weeks away in secret boardroom meetings, preparing to take on the biggest role of my career, all I wanted was to come home, park my bike, and enjoy a quiet sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and gold, the kind of evening that usually brought me peace. But as I pulled into my driveway, something felt off. There, taped to my garage door, fluttering in the breeze like a warning flag, was a bright orange notice that made my stomach turn. It had the unmistakable handwriting of Margaret Whitmore, our power-hungry HOA president. I had only met her twice since moving into the neighborhood 6 months ago, but it was enough. Margaret ruled this community with manicured precision and an iron fist, backed by her designer watch, immaculate lawn, and an army of unwritten rules. The first time we spoke, she scolded me over my grass height being a quarter-inch over standard. The second time, she sent her husband to measure the distance from my mailbox to the curb, because, apparently, compliance meant control. This time, it was my motorcycle, my pride and joy. A 2023 Harley Davidson Road Glide, polished to perfection and parked neatly in my own driveway. I'd spent weekends maintaining it, teaching neighborhood kids how to clean chrome, even chatting about engines with old Mr. Johnson from next door. But none of that mattered to Margaret. The notice read, "Violation. Unauthorized vehicle storage. Motorcycle must be removed within 48 hours or face immediate towing and fines." Beneath it, in elegant cursive, she added, "Motorcycles lower property values and attract the wrong kind of element." The words stung, not just because of the ignorance, but because they came from someone who had no idea who she was talking to. To her, I was just another undesirable with a loud bike and a leather jacket. What she didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that the press release had just been finalized. In 1 week, I'd be publicly named the new CEO of Harley Davidson. I could have told her, could have shut this whole thing down right then and there, but I didn't. Instead, I took a deep breath and started taking pictures. The bike, the notice, my spotless property. Because something told me this wasn't just about a motorcycle. It was about control, corruption, and something much bigger than one orange slip of paper. And Margaret? Well, she was about to find out exactly who she was messing with. It was barely 6 a.m. when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the security camera on my driveway. At first, I figured it was just a raccoon or maybe the neighbor's cat. But as I glanced at the footage, my heart rate spiked. A tow truck, blue, loud, and clearly labeled Peterson's Towing, was reversing slowly into my driveway like it had every right to be there. And chained behind it, my Harley. My pristine, showroom-level, top-of-the-line Harley-Davidson Road Glide being dragged away like a piece of junk. I barely had time to throw on a shirt and run outside. But by the time I made it to the curb, the truck had already turned the corner, disappearing like a thief at sunrise. The audacity of it all was stunning. Not only had they moved up the 48-hour notice without warning, they'd executed a coordinated pre-dawn heist. And make no mistake, that's exactly what it was. A theft dressed up in a reflective vest and a clipboard. Moments later, a new message buzzed in. From Margaret, of course. Unauthorized vehicle has been removed per HOA regulations. Office hours begin at 9 a.m. Short, smug, surgical. I could practically hear her sipping her overpriced herbal tea, patting herself on the back for a job well done. Let's be clear, this wasn't about community standards or keeping the neighborhood classy. This was a power play, a personal attack, a targeted hit delivered by a woman who saw chrome and horsepower as threats to her perfectly trimmed hedges, and who just so happened to be best friends with the guy running the towing company. Margaret thought I'd roll over, pay her ridiculous fines, and tuck my tail between my legs. What she didn't know was that I hadn't spent the last 25 years building Harley-Davidson's legacy just to be pushed around by someone who thinks motorcycles are an eyesore. This was no longer about a bike. It was about the principle. And now, it was personal. I could have sulked. I could have swallowed my anger and paid the outrageous storage fees just to get my Harley back. But that's not who I am. That's not who we are. When someone tries to rob you blind under the disguise of a rule book, you don't just sit back. You start flipping pages. And that's exactly what I did. I poured myself a double espresso, cracked open my laptop, and dove headfirst into every line of the HOA regulations. If Margaret and her goon Tom thought I'd just accept their Article 7, Section 12 nonsense, they were about to get a taste of what real due diligence looks like. 3 hours and 27 documents later, I had found something very interesting. The so-called rule banning motorcycles in driveways. It didn't exist. At least, not until a very recent revision Margaret quietly uploaded to the HOA website, without board approval. That's when the pieces started falling into place. Tom Peterson's towing company had been registered just 4 months ago, shortly after he became Margaret's special advisor for community enforcement. The address of his towing lot, shared with Margaret's real estate office, and the cherry on top? HOA records showed that Tom's company had received over $47,000 in towing fees in the last 3 months alone. For a neighborhood this size, that's not enforcement. That's a cash grab. Fueled by caffeine and fury, I called Sarah Wu, a longtime friend and clerk at the county office. "I need public records," I said. "Every financial document tied to this HOA, this bank account, and these 2 names." By 8 a.m., I was waiting outside her office, documents in hand and questions on my tongue. What Sarah found next made my jaw clench. Margaret had moved the HOA's bank account to a small local bank, where Tom just happened to sit on the board of directors. The storage lot where my Harley was being kept? Owned by Tom's wife. And the fees they were charging? 3 times the legal limit. This wasn't just petty HOA drama anymore. This was corruption. Collusion, a racket built on intimidation, secrecy, and greed. And suddenly it wasn't just about me. It was about the Jacksons, who lost their vintage Mustang, the Garcias, whose triumph disappeared while they were on vacation, even Mrs. Chen's grandson, his first car towed during a family dinner. Enough was enough. I wasn't just fighting to get my motorcycle back. I was fighting for every neighbor who'd been silenced, manipulated, and robbed. The gears were turning, the engine was revving, and now it was time to go full throttle. The deeper I dug, the more rotten it became. What started with one illegally towed Harley quickly unraveled into something far more sinister. A web of backdoor deals, forged documents, and a power-hungry HOA president who thought no one would ever look twice. But she made one crucial mistake. She picked a fight with someone who knows how to fight back. With Sarah's help at the county clerk's office, I collected public records, cross-referenced business registrations, and audited every community improvement fee that Margaret had ever pushed through. And the result? A pile of evidence tall enough to bury an empire. Turns out, Tom Peterson wasn't just towing cars. He was towing opportunity, autonomy, and for some families, their very livelihoods. Peterson's Premium Towing Service, LLC, had been registered a mere 4 months ago. That alone was suspicious. But the listed address? It wasn't a proper business lot. It was Margaret's real estate office. And Tom's wife? She owned the impound lot, where the towed vehicles were held hostage, racking up fees that would make payday lenders blush. The more I looked, the more obvious it became. This wasn't code enforcement. This was extortion. But the real kicker? The HOA banking change. Margaret had quietly moved all HOA accounts to a smaller local bank just 6 months ago. A bank where, surprise, Tom Peterson sat on the board of directors. That meant every HOA check written to Peterson's Towing, every inflated fee, and every suspicious transaction was going through the very people who stood to profit the most. No oversight, no approval from residents, just smoke, mirrors, and Margaret's immaculate signature. I started connecting the dots, printing everything, documenting every name, every date, every dollar. One receipt led to another, until finally, the numbers began painting a picture, one I could no longer ignore. Over the past year, Margaret and Tom had orchestrated a series of so-called vehicle removals that lined their pockets while forcing homeowners to pay up or lose their property. Vintage Mustangs, restored motorcycles, even a teenager's first car, Gone. Auctioned. And many of those auctions conducted without permits or proper notices. And then came the smoking gun. My neighbor Jimmy, a part-time worker at Peterson's Towing, showed up at my door with shaking hands and a file folder. Inside were photos, emails, and receipts. Proof that Margaret and Tom had been running similar towing scams in 3 other neighborhoods. And they were planning to expand further. That night, I sat at my home office, the floor around me littered with papers, post-its, and open files. On my laptop, I had every document scanned and backed up. On my phone, I had photos of the illegal impound lot, footage from my garage camera showing the Harley being towed before the 48-hour notice period, and a list of every homeowner affected. This wasn't just about HOA greed anymore. This was about organized theft under the disguise of governance. And I wasn't alone anymore. I had allies now. Neighbors, mechanics, veterans, even local media. People who had been too scared, too tired, or too hopeless to stand up until someone finally said, enough. Margaret and Tom had spent months, maybe years, building this castle of lies. But now, I was about to burn it to the ground. The time for quiet gathering was over. I had the evidence. I had the names. I had the timeline, the money trail, the auction slips, the fake revisions to HOA policies, and the paper trail showing Margaret and Tom had turned our neighborhood into a gold mine of corruption. Now, it was time to turn everything I had into a movement. The first thing I did was call Ray Martinez, president of the State Motorcycle Rights Association. We'd worked together once to fight an unfair helmet law, and when I told him what Margaret and Tom were doing, how they were targeting bikers, towing motorcycles, and auctioning them off to line their own pockets, Ray didn't just listen. He mobilized. Within the hour, my inbox was flooded with messages from motorcycle clubs across the state, each one more furious than the last. Veterans clubs, classic bike associations, women's riding collectives, they were ready. Ready to ride, ready to stand, ready to help expose the HOA from hell. But it wasn't just the riders. Word started spreading. Mrs. Garcia came by with her son in tears. His car had been towed during Christmas Eve. The Jacksons found out their vintage Mustang had been auctioned off without warning. Mr. Thompson, who'd lovingly restored his old Ford pickup, told me he never got a single letter before it disappeared. Each story was like adding fuel to a growing fire. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a system built on fear, silence, and shady loopholes. And now, it was coming undone. We printed flyers, we organized Zoom calls, we started a group chat with residents who had never even spoken to one another before. Teachers, nurses, grandparents, mechanics, all united by one simple truth. We'd been taken advantage of, and we weren't going to be quiet anymore. I worked around the clock, compiling a massive file of every violation, fee, and fraudulent action. My legal team at Harley Davidson prepared a cease and desist order. My assistant Maria reached out to local news stations, and one by one, they confirmed coverage. I even reached out to the DA's office. A forensic accountant joined our cause and began sifting through HOA payments, each line on the spreadsheet another nail in Margaret and Tom's coffin. Then came the final push. One anonymous tip, one simple text. Auction moved up, tomorrow, 9 o'clock a.m. Margaret and Tom were panicking. They knew someone was closing in, and they were trying to sell my Harley and dozens of other abandoned vehicles before they could be legally stopped. I took one last look around my home office, walls covered in documents, every dot connected, every lie uncovered. Then I hit send. Emails went flying to every HOA board member, every news outlet, every community contact I had. Attached were the files, the receipts, the proof, the truth. By the time the sun came up the next morning, the streets were rumbling. Not with fear this time, but with hope. The cavalry had arrived, and they weren't just here to reclaim one stolen motorcycle. They were here to reclaim an entire neighborhood. Saturday morning arrived like a storm on the horizon. Quiet at first, almost deceptively peaceful. I sat on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the neighborhood that, just weeks ago, had been ruled by fear and silence. Not anymore. The calm didn't last long. At exactly 8 o'clock a.m., the distant rumble of engines echoed down the street. First a handful, then dozens. Then a tidal wave of chrome, leather, and resolve. They came in force. The Veterans Motorcycle Club led the procession, followed by rows of riders from every corner of the state. Cruisers, choppers, vintage bikes, women's clubs, father-son duos, even electric bikes buzzing softly between the louder growls. Every one of them wore a vest with the same words on the back. Ride free, live fair. Margaret stumbled outside in her silk-pink bathrobe, still holding her garden hose, curlers bouncing with every frantic step. The hose dropped from her hand as she watched in horror. Hundreds of motorcycles legally parked up and down the street. Neighbors came out too. They weren't complaining. They were smiling, cheering, waving. Mrs. Chen handed out cookies. The Rodriguez kids ran a lemonade stand. Even grumpy old Mr. Johnson was showing off his restored Harley to a crowd of kids. But the real moment came when I walked up to Margaret, a sealed envelope in hand. "Beautiful morning for a community gathering, isn't it?" I said, offering the envelope. Inside was a cease and desist letter from my legal team, along with photographic evidence of every illegal tow, every fake notice, every bank transfer. Margaret's face twisted, but I wasn't finished. "Oh, and one more thing," I added calmly. "You keep calling me Mr. Zeitz in your paperwork. That's technically correct, but going forward, you might want to address me by my full title." I pulled out my wallet, flipped it open, and revealed my Harley-Davidson executive badge. CEO. The silence hit like thunder. Cameras clicked. News crews zoomed in. Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came. Just as she turned to storm away, a police cruiser pulled up behind her, lights flashing low. 2 officers stepped out, both fellow riders, both holding search warrants, and parked in my driveway. My Harley. Cleaned, polished, and returned with a sign that read, "Protected by the U.S. Constitution and the CEO of Harley-Davidson." The war wasn't just over. It had been won. The collapse was swift, like a house of cards caught in a hurricane of truth. Once the warrants were served, once the news stations aired the footage of Margaret's own security camera showing her ordering my Harley to be towed before the legal deadline, the lies she built her kingdom on disintegrated. Margaret and Tom didn't just lose their grip on the HOA, they lost every ounce of credibility they ever had. The community they once ruled with silence and fear was now speaking louder than ever. At the emergency HOA meeting, the turnout was unlike anything this neighborhood had seen before. People lined the walls, filled the hallways, watched through windows. I walked to the front with a calm resolve, holding a thick file that felt heavier than paper. It held justice. One by one, neighbors stood and told their stories. Towed cars, hidden fees, shattered trust. And then, with unanimous votes and thunderous applause, Margaret and Tom were removed from power, banned permanently from the board, and handed over to authorities. But we didn't stop there. This wasn't just about taking out the corrupt, it was about rebuilding stronger. We launched new community programs, motorcycle safety courses, mechanic scholarships for local youth, and monthly neighborhood rides that brought families together. Mr. Thompson offered his garage for car maintenance workshops. Mrs. Chen started free gardening classes. The community center, once cold and silent, now buzzed with laughter, music, and shared purpose. What once was a neighborhood ruled by petty power plays had become a united front of neighbors, friends, and families. We proved that even the most intimidating systems can be taken down when good people stand up, speak up, and rise up. And in the middle of it all, the Harley sat gleaming in my driveway, not just a motorcycle, but a symbol of resistance, of courage, and of a community that refused to be broken. We didn't just take our neighborhood back. We built something better. 6 months after the storm passed, I stood on my front porch, coffee in hand, watching a scene I never thought I'd see. Children laughing as they learn to change spark plugs in a free community workshop, seniors sharing stories beneath the shade of restored oaks, and neighbors greeting one another not with suspicion, but with warmth. The same streets once ruled by fear and silence now echoed with laughter, respect, and unity. We didn't just rebuild a neighborhood, we transformed it. What began with a single, unjust parking violation turned into something far more powerful. A reckoning that revealed what happens when authority is misused, and more importantly, what can happen when people come together to fight for what's right. Through months of struggle, frustration, and late nights filled with paperwork and planning, we uncovered corruption, held the guilty accountable, and reclaimed not just property, but our peace of mind. And through it all, something even more meaningful emerged: a real sense of community. Our community center, once sterile and empty, now hosts weekly gatherings. Seniors like Mrs. Chen offer gardening lessons. Retired mechanics like Mr. Thompson teach teens how to care for their first car. Even former skeptics joined the cause, now helping young families feel safe and supported. The isolation is gone, replaced by connection. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, and what I hope everyone, especially those of us with more years behind us than ahead, takes to heart, it's this: it's never too late to stand up for justice. It's never too late to change the story. We sometimes think we've seen it all, that things are the way they are and always will be. But change doesn't start with sweeping speeches or grand gestures. It starts with a voice that says, "This isn't right." A neighbor that says, "You're not alone." A community that says, "Let's fix this, together." To every senior listening, your voice still matters. Your wisdom is still needed. And your courage, yes, even now, can shape the world around you in ways more powerful than you realize. As I look at my Harley gleaming in the driveway, no longer a target but a symbol, I know one thing for sure. We didn't just win a fight. We reignited a spirit. And that, in the end, is the kind of legacy worth leaving behind.